EU, Andrew.
I understand that, which is why we're here to talk about it tonight. Let's come on to workers' rights. You mentioned that right at the top. Now, you've argued that the EU safeguards British workers' rights. Why are we incapable of doing that ourselves?
We're capable of doing both. One of the things about this debate, Andrew, is the Leave campaign suggests we can either have workers' rights in Britain or we can have them in Europe, or we can either trade with Europe or we can trade with the rest of the world. The truth is we can do both. And I'll tell you why we have them. Because if there weren't common rights, and the European Union protects workers' rights right across the EU, limits on working time, paid holiday, fair rights for women at work, protection for agency and temporary workers. The Leave campaigners describe those as red tape and bureaucracy and regulation.
Are you really saying, let's take paid holiday, which everybody counts on. Are you really saying that if we left the EU, we'd no longer be able to count on paid holiday? We've had paid holidays since 1938, which was a little bit before joining the European Union.
Well, we didn't have in this country, as you know, Andrew, until the Working Time Directive was passed, a statutory right to paid holiday for every worker in the United Kingdom, and we didn't have limits on working time. And I'll tell you why there is a risk. Priti Patel, who's one of the prominent Leave campaigners, has said she'd like to halve employment rights. Boris Johnson complained that the Prime Minister didn't get to grips with this problem, as he sees it, during the renegotiation. When Ian Duncan Smith was on your programme and was asked, well, what is this bureaucracy you don't like? What did he refer to? Health and safety legislation. And my challenge to them is this. You know, I worked for the trade union movement for 20 years. I know how hard it was to win those rights. But what rights are they going to seek to take away? And it's about time they came clean to the British people.
All right,
but there's a second reason,
No,
Andrew.
I'm not going to let you go into the second,
no,
because
the second
you need to answer
why
the question
I'm
first.
answering the question.
No, I'm going to ask it. How much of paid holiday does the EU guarantee?
It guarantees less than currently applies in the UK because it is a flaw.
Right, and
it's
British
a flaw,
law,
and it prevents
but British law
a race to the
guarantees
bottom.
more paid holiday than EU law.
And
so why would we lose that if we came out of the EU?
And that shows exactly why we can build on the basic rights that Europe provides. But
we had it before the EU.
We didn't have a statutory right to paid holiday. And, for example, it was a judgment of the European Court of Justice, Andrew, that won for women part-time workers the right to join pension schemes under a court case that was brought. But why do we have common rights across Europe? I'll tell you why. We have a single market with single rules. If there weren't common employment rights across Europe, it allows the bad employer to undercut the good and the worst employer to undercut the bad. If one European country said, right, no, we're going to weaken our workers' rights, and jobs started disappearing from Britain towards that country, what is the first thing that people would say? We need common rules throughout the European Union, and therefore those workers' rights protect workers right across all 28 member states. But Mr. Benn,
there is no prospect of any British government being elected that was going to abolish or reduce paid holidays or reduce maternity and paternity leave. That's not going to happen. It's just scaremongering.
It isn't scaremongering because I'm taking the Leave campaigners on their own words.
They're not the government, and they're not being elected as a government. I mean, let's just take maternity leave. How much does the EU law guarantee on maternity leave?
We have better provision now because we chose to do that. But it's still
British
important.
Law.
Exactly.
Why would that change if we left the EU?
It's not a competition between the two, but the Leave campaigners, significant figures, as you know, Andrew, in the Leave campaign have said one of their targets, if we leave the European Union, is to weaken workers' rights, which they describe as red tape and regulation. And there's lots of people who go to work who are protected by health and safety legislation. When Chris Grayling, who is a member of the government and a prominent Leave campaigner, says that he regards that as bureaucracy and regulation,
But Mr. Benn,
we're perfectly entitled to ask them.
They would have to be elected to do
that. Well, indeed,
that.
the trouble is we have a Conservative government.
And which has not reduced paid holiday, which has not reduced maternity leave, hasn't reduced paternity leave. And if a Labour government was elected in 2020 outside the EU, you could strengthen these protections. You would have a mandate to do so.
Indeed, and we have a much better record of doing that. As
So why
Labour
do you
in
need
government,
the EU?
the Conservatives have ever done it, for the reason I set out, that it provides protection right across the EU and it prevents a race to the bottom. And that helps workers in Britain as well as in other European
countries. But Norway,
countries.
Iceland, Switzerland, they're all outside the EU. They all score better than the UK, according to the Trade Union Confederation, when it comes to workers' rights. It's a matter of the democratic decision of a country.
My argument, Andrew, is you can have both. You can have a floor of basic rights right across Europe that protects workers, prevents a race to the bottom, and you can top that up by decisions that you take as a sovereign member state. You get the best of both worlds.
Let's move on to